Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Addis Ababa Noir, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. It was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Whiting. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, authors like Maaza and Mikael, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so very appreciative of it. Tonight, we are beyond excited to have with us Maaza Mengiste to celebrate the release of Addis Ababa Noir, a short story collection she edited. Maaza is a novelist and essayist who was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. She is the recipient of fellowships from the Fulbright Scholar Program, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Creative Capital. Her debut novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, was selected by The Guardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books and named one of the best books of 2010 by the Christian Science Monitor, Boston Globe, and other publications. Her work can be found in The New Yorker, New York Review of Books, Granta, The Guardian, The New York Times, Rolling Stone, and BBC, among other places. She was a writer on the documentary projects Girl Rising and The Invisible City, Kakuma. Her second novel, The Shadow King, was published in September 2019 and was just longlisted for the Booker Prize. She is the editor of Addis Ababa Noir. Joining Maaza in conversation is Mikael Awaki. Mikael is a writer based in Brooklyn, New York, who was born in Boston to Ethiopian parents. His fiction has appeared in McSweeney's, Witness, and Callaloo. He is currently an assistant professor of creative writing at Lafayette College. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Maaza and Mikael to the stage.
Hey.
Hi, Nick. Good to see you.
Great to see you.
Everybody here, but thank you all for joining us. And Saber disappeared before we could say goodbye to him, but thank you for that.
Thank you, Saber.
Thank you. Mick, okay, we're here to talk about Addis Ababa Noir. Yes, I'm so excited to launch it and to launch it with you. You and I have been in conversation about literature and books way in the beginning. I mean, I think we met when I was a grad student and you were a student at Columbia. Am I right?
I think I was a postgraduate at that time, kind of floating around. but yeah, I think we met at like a Penn literary event. I think we didn't like speak that first time, but definitely
we don't speak to each other, we just stare.
Exactly, just notice the eyes. And
so it's really fitting that that we're here together for this thing. I remember when I was thinking about writers that I knew that I could contact for this anthology, you were one of the first names that came to mind. And because I knew of your writing, and you have to refresh my memory a little bit, but I remember this story you had published of a taxi driver that was speaking to somebody, and at some point he realized that person was not in the car, that it was, I think, a ghost of somebody else that had died that he knew.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, that was a story about a taxi driver in New York who picks up different versions of himself, and it's kind of he's a person who fled the Derg and the kind of situation in Ethiopia during the 70s. So yeah, thank you for remembering that. I can't believe you remember that.
Yeah, the story stuck with me. And so when I thought of you for this, I think one of the things that I didn't give any writers direction in what to write necessarily, but one of the things I was hoping was that the stories that would come out would reflect the many levels of reality that exist in Ethiopia, partly because it's a very religious country. It is Christian, it is Muslim, it is indigenous languages, it's also Pentecostal. You know, so we have all of these different religions in this one country, and in one way or another, there's a reality, there's life, I guess I would say, on the ground, and then there's life up above that's beyond the physical.
Right.
And I know that when I read that and other short story of yours, I said, Mick is somebody that I think can really capture that. And you wrote this incredible story that draws from a childhood story that I remembered, this myth. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about this myth, this belief, superstition. Tell us a little about your story and then read a short section from it.
I'd love to, and thank you so much for that, those generous words. It means so much coming from you, and you know, and I was really thrilled to be invited to contribute to this collection, which I'm so excited to talk about with you and with everyone in the chat. Yeah, this story really started, I remember, you know, getting the prompt to write a noir story and didn't really have much experience with that as a genre. And then kind of really having a lot of fun kind of writing different stories in that vein. And I think in the midst of, you know, kind of generating drafts, I, you know, was talking to my parents about the legend, the myth of these kind of were hyena people who live, in my imagination, in the mountains, kind of above, you know, physically above the city, in this neighborhood that my father's family has lived in for a long time, called Kajane. And so that is supposed to be a hub of these were hyena folks who are called Moritai. And so, you know, I've always, you know, had an interest in, like, you know, the supernatural elements of Ethiopian folklore, and the metaphors that they can speak to, the flexibility of them, what they may say about, you know, a people. So when I heard that and I was thinking about noir, I just kind of wanted to put my spin on the Moritai legend, and came up with the story that is in the collection. So should I read a little bit?
Please.
Okay, so this is from about halfway through the story, and the story is called Father Bread. And I guess what you need to know up to this point is that it's about a young boy who kind of washes up on the doorstep of an orphanage in Addis Ababa in Kajane. And he's from the countryside. You know, there's a lot of migration from, and has been over the years, from the countryside and the more rural areas into the urban centers, in particular Addis Ababa. So this part is kind of a flashback to the thing that forces the young boy to leave the countryside. And so just kind of starts with his father speaking to him, and he's kind of a mean father. "Get up," said his father, glaring. "Sleep outside tonight." The boy had food in his mouth still, but he was too upset to keep chewing. He felt like spitting it out, but he knew the waste of it would only bring a lashing with the ox whip. He kept the unchewed food in his cheeks and stepped from the warmth of the firelit room into the cold, echoing chamber of night. On the dirt floor of the shed behind the house, He lay awake beside the ox plow, unswallowed food fermenting in his cheeks like the bad feelings in his chest. This was supposed to teach him a lesson. But what was the lesson? It never came. His punishment never meant anything. He could never predict or understand it. The lesson that night was supposed to be about self-restraint, as it often was. So the boy silently scolded himself for his selfishness. He had a reputation, after all, for not knowing how to control his urges, for being greedy. He grew self-conscious about his desires, ashamed of his wants, his longings. He no longer knew what he desired. He no longer ate food without being told to eat. His father's lessons taught him nothing but shame as he sat in the ox plow shed. The air in there was stuffy, and the smell of rust, manure, and soil was pervasive. The hoot of owls, the distant growl of mountain lions, and the hiss of other unseen nocturnal creatures prowling the land slipped easily through the shed's porous metal walls. The boy never slept well in the shed, but he knew that his pain was the point. He hasn't known a day of hardship, he heard his father bellow. He is not grateful, I will make him grateful. And come morning, with bits of injera still rotting in his cheeks, the boy would be grateful, but not in the way his father could have imagined. That was the night the hyenas came.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The story was incredibly powerful, and I think the thing that struck me first is the way that this little boy adapts to the harshness of his father. I won't say very much, and the role that hyenas play in that. And I had a conversation recently with Johnny Temple, and it's a video that I think was just released on Akashic's website. And we were talking about this myth of men who turn into hyenas. You know, I heard that as a child growing up. As a child in Ethiopia, I just thought it was real. I had no one to tell me that it wasn't possible. Yeah. And I often, you know, there are a number of stories in this book that deal with ghosts in one way or another, that seem to deal with these otherworldly realities.
Yes.
And I remember as a child, when people in my neighborhood were disappearing because of the Derg and it was the revolution, that my mind automatically turned those disappearances into people who turned into hyenas. That's why we can't see them anymore, is because this is how they escaped and this is how they've lived. They've continued to survive. Wow. And I really wonder about the presence of, you know, the hyenas in your story, the presence of ghosts in so many of these stories that feel very, it's striking, because I've read other noir collections and that's not apparent in other collections. This seems, you know, not that it doesn't happen, but this is what struck me. Maybe we can talk about that. What do you make of that?
That's such a great question, and I'm just like still stuck on thinking that the people who were disappeared by the Derg had just turned into hyenas and were off in the hills. That's such a kind of haunting way of, but also beautiful, like weirdly hopeful and beautiful way of thinking about the loss of that time. I think, I mean, for me, you know, like your story in particular about which is beautiful and feels capacious in the way that your novels do, is about disappearance, right? And it's about this kind of, it almost stretches the imagination, the depth of the violence of that period, the depth of the loss, the depth of the grief, and I think that, you know, you know, it's possible that there aren't really the tools of facts, right? Which are so often aligned with the state, right?
Yeah.
Which of what is real and what is official. This is history, that you know that to be a lie, right? And you know so much of that to be a lie that you find a home in fiction. And fiction becomes a way to fill the gaps
Yeah.
of those erasures, those disappearances. And I know, you know, growing up that, you know, I had parents who were more or less exiled as a result of what was happening, and those absences, you know, were something that I definitely reached for beneath the lion's gaze to kind of understand. Reached for, you know, the work of Dina Mengiste as well to understand, and others, Nagam is like, yes. So I think, you know, that's my kind of thinking about that. I'm curious about the root of, if you could speak a little bit about, you know, your work on the story Dust, Ash, Flight in the collection.
Yeah, I can, thank you. I can talk a little bit about it. This is a short story that I had been working on for a long time. And the premise of the story is that there's an Argentine forensic scientists group that, that is going to Ethiopia with an Argentine photographer. They are there to excavate sites, the mass graves around prison sites or areas where there were mass killings. They are collecting evidence. They're collecting bones and collecting evidence so that the Derg officials who are put on trial in the 90s, there's evidence against them. In addition to witness testimony, you need evidence, you need these bones, you need proof that these people were killed. And I have in here a photographer, Argentine photographer who was himself a prisoner during the Argentine Dirty Wars, which were happening around the same time as the Red Terror in Ethiopia. And in my story, this Argentine photographer was forced to take photographs in the prison of prisoners just before they were executed for the collection of some of, you know, so that these Argentine officers could collect them as trophies. Over the course of the story, this photographer has a friendship with a man who's looking for his disappeared son, an Ethiopian man. And the story is really, you know, about the two of them and the story of this man. But the story itself, the idea of it it really stepped forward for me, because in my research for my first novel, I came across a group of Argentine forensic scientists led by a woman who had really traveled to Ethiopia to dig for bones in these sites.
Wow.
And this is a true story.
That's what I was about to ask. Yeah, wow.
So those scientists were digging, and the woman that led the group, I called her one day out of the blue when I was researching for this story. And I said, could you tell me some things about what it was like to be there? Because all of these Argentine forensic scientists, part of the motivation for them to go into their field was the dirty wars. And to realize that if we don't have evidence, how do we accuse these people? We need evidence and proof, you know, that these people existed and now they're killed. And they've gone from there they went from there to Kosovo, to Bosnia, to everywhere you can imagine where there were mass killings. This group was traveling around. And when I called this woman, I happened to find her in New York City. And I asked her for information, and she couldn't, of course, give me everything, but she was able to send me documents. And So I had details of what they found, and I was able to put them into the story. The photographer, Mick, actually existed also.
I was sure that was your creation. Wow.
Yeah, so, and this photographer is a man named Victor, and he was an Argentine prisoner. He did not go. I made up the story that he went to Ethiopia, but he did exist, and he smuggled out photographs in Buenos Aires and gave them to families. And that was the only proof sometimes that their children had been killed. And I wondered what would happen if you bring those people who come from a country and a land that has been so traumatized, and you put them in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, in a country that's equally traumatized. You know,
yeah.
What happens? What is that conversation like? And so that was really the motivation and the question behind my story.
I mean, yeah, as you're speaking too, I'm thinking about the way that story opens up a new kind of diaspora, right? A diaspora of those who have suffered under the heel of fascist, authoritarian regimes. And I don't think I've ever really read anything that kind of tries to, put someone who survived the Argentinian dirty wars in conversation, and in not only in conversation, but in kind of, ultra verbal, super verbal, like non-verbal communication and connection. It's really powerful to think of that, there are other diasporas besides the, that there is solidarity, right? Outside of, just Ethiopian movement. But Ethiopian movement is such a big part of this. I think what I love about this collection is that, yes, it's Addis Ababa Noir, and it's set in this very dynamic, multidimensional space, but it's also reaching to so many different other parts of the world at the same time. There's Teferi Nigussie Tafa's story of migration to Europe, and I think it's Germany in that story. And there's, Hannah Giorgis' story that takes place in DC as well as in Addis Ababa, in Shiromeda, and your story, Argentina. And so I'm wondering if that was something that came organically from the submissions, or if that was something, you kind of, I don't know, looked for in the writers that you solicited.
Yeah, I asked each of the writers to pick a section of Addis Ababa that they wanted to write about. And that was it. And the only thing we tried to make sure was that there was no repetition, there was no overlap. And, quite ironically, maybe everybody picked a different section. So nobody had, maybe there was one that wanted, maybe two people wanted Mercato, or maybe I picked the one that was left. And it's surprising, Addis Ababa, that there wasn't a story quite set in Mercato yet, but I got that one. It was free. But Bewketu Seyoum has Arat Kilo, Lelissa Girma had Haya Hulet. There were everybody had their own sections.
Yeah.
And they picked it for the flavor of the story and maybe their familiarity with that area, but also like you, they were picking sections because those areas are known for certain things.
Right.
I found that with everyone's choices, it gives such a better sense of the diversity of Africa. I would say Africa as a whole. Ethiopia, but also particularly Addis Ababa. To me, Addis Ababa is metropolitan. It is cosmopolitan in many ways. I know in my research for the second book, when I was writing, I was looking at Addis Ababa in 1935 and comparing it to Rome in 1935, and some other cities in Italy and in the south, Addis Ababa was more cosmopolitan.
Right.
It's always had different populations. It has always been diverse. Ethiopia has always been diverse. But I was hoping that the stories would take this area and begin to reflect a little bit of that difference. And I found that the styles, the voices, the choices in the kinds of stories they wanted to tell. I mean, some are really funny, some are hilarious. It's always like treading the line between darkly humorous and just flat out funny. Adam Reta's story was just wonderful. And then you have stories like Linda Yohannes and Hannah's story, and Meron's, and there's some seriousness, but a liveliness there, and I was really happy to read those differences.
So it's so wonderful stylistically, as you said, and content in terms of what people are writing about. I really loved Sulaiman Addonia's story of kind of grappling with sex and the body and the erotic through a queer narrator. It was just so powerful and well done. And I guess there are these stories. It is a noir anthology, right? So there's a feeling that there should be like some kinds of violations, and I'm wondering what you think of the way that the collection kind of handles those, like the different ways that everyone in the collection handles violation and crime.
I think that's a really good question. It was one of the things that I had to think about way at the beginning of this, because some writers are not very familiar with the noir genre, and I think if somebody were going to ask me, I would have a lot of trouble with noir. It's not a style that I would necessarily be comfortable with. So the one direction I gave people was, this is not these are not stories that have a moral at the end of the story. These are not instructional stories. These, make them dark if you want, but understand that, it doesn't end happily for most people in noir, one way or another. And that was really the only direction I gave. And what came back were stories that really looked at what you called the violations in society. These are stories about the disintegrations in the worlds of these characters in one way or another. What is noir after all, except a society in decay in one way or another, that's slowly devolving or destroying itself. And these stories reflected that in many different ways. Whether it was through dark humor or very, very touching, moving scenes, or through things that were very uncomfortable, or by absolutely looking at it in a very sexual context, like Sulaiman's story. Maybe Adam Reta's story also with a man who's having an affair, and I won't give too much away, but it goes in directions that I did not expect. So these were it was really interesting to get them, and I did not give any direction like, you have to write this. I was interested to see what came back, and it was amazing. But I'm curious about, let's talk about the story that got published in here. I think you did a radical revision at one point, to the point where I literally, when your story came up and I read the revision, I sat back for a minute and I said, oh my God, he did it. Like, how the hell did that happen? Talk to me about your revision process.
Well, so I think part of this is like, so you emailed, I got the email from you 5 years ago. I was checking my emails and I was like, you know, and I knew you were deep in the middle of the Shadow, what eventually became the Shadow King. And I remember talking to you about, you know, how you were getting over certain hurdles with character development in that. And you know, we started this process, and I don't know if you remember this, but I sent you like basically the prompt that you gave me to write one noir story resulted in 3 stories that you know, the first one, and with each one I was really trying to like get you to kind of like have that reaction, because like I know when you like something. And so I was like, it's not good enough yet. Maaza didn't, you know. And so it was really just like trying to impress you and trying to like you know, just really trying to write a great story that would make you you know, really excited and make me excited. That really just kept pushing me to not only revise but actually like blank page rewrite, reimagine. Yeah.
So you know, that blank page rewrite, I don't know if you and I have talked about this, but I absolutely swear by that.
Really? I didn't know that.
I often tell writers, start again, just do it again. And most people are terrified to do that. So Mick, for the writers that are listening in, you know, those people who might be in MFAs or might be in the middle of a project, how did you decide, okay, I'm just going to do it again? Because that's a step, that's a leap that's often really frightening.
Yeah, no, I think everyone has a maybe different relationship to revision, and it maybe changes piece to piece, project to project. But for this, I think, and for all the writers who are in the Zoom, that you know, oftentimes the first draft is you're trying to work out, you know, certain kind of ideas or, you know, images or metaphors. And I remember my first story was kind of, you know, and I was also playing with different memories. I was born in and raised in the States, so my relationship to Addis Ababa is mostly through the summer trips that I would take with my family after, you know, after the like basically after the mid 90s, when it was kind of when the new government came into power after the Derg. So I think my relationship was really through those memories and just trying to you know, think of family stories that have always stuck with me. And I think you know, sometimes you have to kind of write them down to see, oh, does this hold up as something interesting or even worth like finishing. And and so I did that a couple of times. My first story was kind of about a pharmacist based on one of my uncles, and then I did another one that was based on a kind of I think another family story I'm forgetting right now. But then this one was just kind of, oh yes, this makes me happy to try to kind of do something about, you know, the Moritai, the were hyena in a contemporary context, kind of talking about you know, authoritarian capitalism and just the rapid development of the city over the past kind of several years. So yeah, I think for me, it's like I am a tinkerer, but I don't know if it's like this for you, but I definitely, as I've kind of, you know, maybe matured as a writer, really practiced kind of having a really messy first draft and allowing my like perfectionist streak to kind of get me to go back and make it better rather than trying to make it so perfect the whole way through. I don't know if that resonates.
That makes sense. That's absolutely, that makes perfect sense to me. And I have just one last question, then I think we can maybe start bringing in the audience questions into this. But it was also very interesting that you were born in Boston, but Addis Ababa was the place where you were pretty sure that you wanted to set your story. I think even in the earlier draft that I saw, was that just a natural decision to do that? Because I didn't give anyone direction on
right
diasporic, but your story was firmly rooted in Addis Ababa, and I love that.
Yeah, I think, it's the story of the Moritai as being kind of wedded to this neighborhood, Kachane. There's a church that is featured in the story as well, Kidan Emret, Guardian of the World Church, and it's kind of like the neighborhood church, and it's I think, like, when I think about it, it's kind of covered. It's this very, your ears pop when you go to Kachane because it's so high, and it's full of eucalyptus trees, and so there's a way that there's a mysterious and kind of beautiful and very like I don't know, something that seemed really rich to try to set a story. But yeah, I think it was really helpful, really, to have, the prompt of setting it in a specific space and having the place be a character as it is in so many of these pieces. And did you when you were writing about Mercato, was it, was there something you wanted to capture about that kind of?
That place it's always been, it's just crazy. Mercato is, I remember from going there as a child, and even I think the last time I was in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia was just in December, January of this year. And Mercato has completely changed. It feels like it's still crazy, but it at least from my child's mind, when I was, all the times I would visit and when I lived there, it was just a universe on its own where anything could happen there. And I've heard, I've heard people say, whatever you need, you can find it in Mercato, from a goat to whatever else, name it, it's there, everything. And that was kind of I wanted to set a story where within this place that is already, layered with histories and memories, there is this other place that's even more congested, where anything could happen, anything could explode at any moment. And it felt like a natural place to go in terms of my imagination. I don't know if, I think that I wonder what it will be like when I go back, for a visit, because Addis Ababa has changed so much, even in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years. Every time I go, it feels like a completely different city. I don't remember, I think you were there not very long ago.
Yeah, 2 years ago.
2 years ago. And had it changed for you when you were?
Dramatically, yeah. My grandmother lived in Hayahulet, and that part of town now, has a new name. It's, I had this weird kind of echo of what's happening like in Brooklyn with gentrification, where it's just like, this used to look like this and it was called Hayahulet. Now they're calling it something else, and there's all this, there's all this kind of like, there's a plumbing and toilet sales office on the ground floor of my grandmother's house, and then there's like a bank on the top floor, and my aunt's house has turned into a place of business. Just like this residential area has really become a place of commerce, and that was a trip. I kind of didn't know where I was, and it was very disorienting. But yeah, but you know, it's also very lively in kind of ways that and energetic and full of kind of really interesting art and culture that hadn't been there when I'd gone, even like you said, like 5 years previous. So
yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about Addis Ababa is also the way that the migrations we think about, that often we always imagine, you know, we think of them in relation to Africans who are trying to get to Europe, you know, or Syrians trying to get to Europe. Addis Ababa has changed because of those kinds of migrations. And when I was there in January, there were these Syrian restaurants that had popped up because of migration. And so it's interesting to imagine that this is a city that is in the process constantly of remaking itself based on new inhabitants. Yeah, so it feels, in addition to the, you know, the new developments and all of that, there's another layer also arriving. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few years.
For sure.
So here's Saver.
Hi. Sorry to leave in, just bring in the audience questions. Is now an okay moment?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I figure we can start off with one about the collection, or well, the inspiration for the collection on the whole. So Angie asks, what makes Addis Ababa uniquely Noir-y among all the Noir-y cities?
Well, I feel like Addis Ababa Noir. I feel like Addis. I feel like Ethiopia is that it is a beautiful, rich country with dark edges. And I think that a friend of mine told me at some point, we have so much history in this country. And it feels like those layers give the city a pulse. If I were thinking of a writer, right? And Noir feels like, in some ways, a perfect vehicle for some of the realities of Addis Ababa. If Noir is thought of as violations in society. What do you say, Mick?
Yeah, I co-sign that, and I would just, you know, maybe add that, like, I really love this cover too. I know it's kind of beside the point, but I think that like it reminds me that like Addis Ababa feels very different at night, and like there is this, and many cities do feel very different at night. But I think to just kind of echo Maaza's point that that there are these histories that these stories are really reckoning with, these, you know, ruptures in the social fabric that kind of leave an existential, I don't know, feeling of wandering, of searching, you know, of not knowing what to do. There's a line that I love almost at the very end of the collection from Teferi Nigussie Tafa story that says, maybe struggle is not good, maybe struggle is a curse. And the whole story has been about struggle and about kind of like the beauty of struggle. And it was devastating to read that line in this moment of, you know, Black uprising and rebellion, to think about that as like this really bottomless existential question of maybe struggle is a curse, and you know, and there was that that really was I think part of that noir-y feeling that, you know, that's a deeply existential question embedded in that.
Well, so then I guess the sort of follow-up, which is from Tedessa, is how did the genre, the noir conventions of genre open up the stories that could be told? Like, did you find it created new pathways for you to approach your stories or what you wanted to tell?
You know, I will tell you, at least for the writers, not all the stories, but some of the early drafts of some of the stories I received were stories with a happy ending, where everything was fine in the end. And the stories would feel a little bit predictable, you know, but at the very end, somebody learned a lesson and they became a better person. And when I would go back to some of these writers and say, you know, it doesn't have to be that way. Noir means that you can write about, you know, really dark things or very sad things or things that don't end well, because that's life. That's, you know, you can talk about interactions with human beings. And then the drafts I would get felt like they had completely opened up. And the writers finally felt free to explore, you know, questions about relationships, about right and wrong, about sexuality, about all of these things. And it was wonderful to read. So I think the idea of telling some writers noir means, you know, society's really messed up and you can write about that. And it was a level of freedom that was really, for an editor, it was really great to read.
Okay, and this question is for both of you. So do you feel an obligation to write about the Red Terror, given how little known it is outside of Ethiopian communities? What responsibilities does one have when speaking for the dead?
Wow.
Sorry, heavy.
Heavy, good question. You know, Mick, I have to say, I feel like every writer in here, almost every writer, maybe except for a few, we're the children of revolution. We're the children that were born as, you know, either during or after, whether we had to go into exile or we were born outside because our parents went into exile. And it's really interesting to think about how that experience might have shaped all of these stories in one way or another. The revolution is present in a lot of them, in a lot of stories in one way or another. You know, what was interesting to me was when I read Dina Mengistu's book, The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears, which is an absolutely beautiful book, it was the first time that I had read a writer who basically was like me, had been raised here, but I said, my God, he's been thinking about this thing the same way, and you know, I have. Like, maybe I'm not the only one who has been in some ways obsessing over, why did I come here? What happened? Why does no one talk about it? I don't think writers have an obligation to write about that, but it becomes a preoccupation for some writers because there are still things left to figure out about this. One book will never cover the full experience. 10 books will never cover it. You know, I think about how many millions of people are in Ethiopia right now, and how many actually, you know, have had these, how many are carrying different stories of that time. And those stories are built on top of other stories. And those stories, they, you know, we keep carrying from generation to generation. There are many stories to tell. I don't think we're done with the revolution. I am definitely sure that there are other books coming out. In fact, there's another one. There's one that's coming out by a young writer named Mehret Sabat, and it's coming out in April of 2022. And it's about a young girl during the time of the revolution. And so I'm excited to hear that story, because it's going to be different than what we've heard. But I don't think there's an obligation. What do you think, Mick?
Yeah, I think that, like you said, it's something that I don't think is ever going to be exhausted in terms of the stories that are able to be told about it, or even the kind of like the tones and the approaches and the ways of thinking about it. I love this idea that the past is unpredictable, and I think about that with relation to the Derg, because it is this for I think a lot of us who grew up in spaces outside of Ethiopia, it is as present in the silences as it is in the stories, and so, you know, there's even a question of you know, how silence might have been a result, or might be related to that time period. What could be said and what couldn't be said. And you know, have you ever been to the Derg Museum on the top? It's such a powerful museum, and I thought about you when I went last time, because they have that photo array, and I know that photography is so kind of central to your practice as a writer and an artist, and it's so powerful to see those faces of the disappeared and the dead, because you can't speak for them, like the beautiful question that you presented, Sabir. We can't speak for them, but I think that for a lot of us, storytelling or imagining, you know, what kind of a city might this have been, you know, what kind of a place, what kind of a country might this have been, what kind of a world had this not happened, you know. And I think that was something I felt really strongly when I saw all those really young people, you know, really young people who really believed, you know, in a better society. So
Thank you, Mick.
thank you.
Thank you. That was beautiful. And then, as a lighter question for you, Mick, what is it about the hyena that drew you to write about them in the story?
What was the last part of that drew me?
Yeah, to writing about them.
I think, I mean, just on a certain level, it's like I'd never seen a were-hyena story, and so I wanted to kind of like, you know, there is the werewolf in, you know, there's Teen Wolf, there's some Werewolf in Paris, there's all these kind of American touchstones in popular culture to the werewolf, and it's always this I don't know, hyenas are just like, when you go to Addis and like someone tells you there are hyenas, like that could just like stroll up into the compound or onto the street at night. It's pretty, like the normalization of the hyena in Addis is like, it was very jarring, because I think that there's a way that, like, you know, we think of these like these animals, these creatures, as like very dangerous or very like predatory in the Lion King, which I don't, you know, want to get into right now, but there, you know, the hyenas are like these kind of like vulture-ish, derelict riffraff, but like they're beautiful. Hyenas are beautiful. They're like, I really feel drawn to them as a creature, as beings, and so I just, when my parents told me this story, I was you know, I thought of Thundercats growing up. Like I have these very like pop cultural ways. It was like, is that kind of like a Thundercat, or like different ways of thinking about that myth? But yeah, I think they're just beautiful creatures that get a bad rap, and they laugh. Like,
Oh, we have a question on the subject of diaspora. Alta asks, I'm wondering, did all the stories originate in English, or were some translated from other languages?
There were some stories in here translated from Amharic into English. One of the things that I told the writers, they could write in any language that they wanted, and we would translate them. So they had complete freedom. And I had certain writers who were based in Ethiopia who emailed and said, I would like to write in English. Is that okay? I'm like, of course that's okay. So I think some thought of it as a challenge. And those stories that came were just wonderful. So some were translated though. And then the writers really wanted to write them in English, even though they normally write in Amharic.
And out of curiosity, what was the translation process like? Was there an assigned translator? Did you translate them? Did the authors translate them themselves?
So different processes for different stories, but there was often another translator, and they would translate and sometimes work with the writer. There was a story in here that was translated, and then the writer and I sat, and the translation was beautiful. But there were a couple of sections where he had questions about, so we would look at the Amharic and look at the English, and then we would just talk it through and do some final edits with that. And that was a process that worked really well for that writer and that story. So but some were translated.
So we have time roughly for one question, so I'm going to slip in 1.5.
Okay.
So the half is the book being published in Ethiopia?
Oh, I wish, but this pandemic has put a stop to so much. But we're in the process of, Johnny Temple and I at Akashic, we're in the process of conversations about ways to get distribution there. So once things start moving forward, post this lockdown, shutdown thing, that it should be there. Yeah.
And so the final question would be for both of you, let me see if I can rephrase this. For both the Ethiopian reader and the non-Ethiopian reader, what is it you hope they take away in concept of like Addis Ababa for reading the book?
Oh. Mick, I'm gonna let you go first.
All right, I'll start. I think what Maaza said earlier about the different layers of time that kind of are just kind of right next to each other or right on top of each other in the city. I think the heterogeneous, kind of almost like improvisational way that the city has become what it is. I think that the stories really capture that, and I think that as I've been reading through it, it's just in this time of COVID and not being there, it is a way for me to feel kind of like I'm walking, looking for a Gabi in Shiromeda, or sitting in a bar in Mercato, and I think that's that is, I feel like, something that I'd love for readers to understand about the city, is that it's completely irreducible to anything that you know, one story could encapsulate, one collection could encapsulate. But this does a really good job of it, I think. Maaza snapped.
Well, I think one of the things is maybe that, you know, in the midst of these huge historical moments, you know, everything is happening at once. People are getting married, people are having affairs, people are having sex, you know, young couples are experimenting, people are mourning, people are going through depression, people are falling in love, people are going on their first dates, people are proposing. So many different things are happening on a very human level. And I think that was the one thing that's really struck me about these stories. This is a city just like any other city in many ways. Everything is happening at once. I mean, even here even in lockdown, you know, so much was going on, even when people were locked in their homes. It just was, there are all these human dramas that continue to exist in one way or another. And I think the stories remind me of that.
Well, thank you both so much for an amazing conversation. I dropped the order link in the chat.
Thank you so much, Samir. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
No, happy to have you both. And I'm also going to say thanks on behalf of my mother who tuned in for this event. She's a huge fan of... Thank you, everyone, and have a great night. And if you haven't purchased the book, purchase the book. It sounds incredible. I will be purchasing the book.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Good night.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye, Maaza. Good night, everyone.
Bye, Nick. Bye, Sever.